Hello, Blake Rudis here with EverydayHDR.com and HDRinsider.com. That's my newest HDR endeavor. What I'm going to show you today is what is new in Photomatix Pro 5.0. It has recently been removed from its beta testing and is now open to the public for download. That is, if you already own a previous CD key with Photomatix Pro, then your version will automatically update and you'll be ready for use. If not, then you'll have to pay for it. But when you open up Photomatix Pro 5.0, it pretty much tells you what's new right off the bat, but they're only telling you the main changes. There are some wording changes that you didn't see before that you're going to be seeing here in Photomatix Pro. So I'm going to go over those with you and just kind of drive through this a little bit. For those who have never done HDR before, this is going to be a big help. For those who are already pretty familiar with 4.2.7, have been using it for quite a bit of time, this is mainly going to be a refresher for you. So I'm just going to dive right into this and grab some exposures from my other screen here and bring them in. Nothing new here. This is just loading your brackets, so I'm just going to press OK because I knew exactly which brackets I wanted to load. But if you needed to browse, you could press browse and you could go find those and bring those in. I like to just drag them and drop right into Photomatix, and then I'll press OK. I don't really want the 32-bit unprocessed image to be shown just yet. So here's where you're going to see some major differences. Before, under Align Source Images, there were two options. One of them was by correcting horizontal and vertical shifts, and the other one was by correcting matching features. Now, it was kind of one of those things that you just had to learn by doing it, or actually, if you looked at their tutorial, they also told you which one to select for whether it was taken on a tripod or not. But now, instead of doing that horizontal vertical shifts, they just say, was this taken on a tripod or was it taken handheld? And how do you want to include your perspective correction? Which is very cool because that used to confuse a lot of people. And what I covered in 11 Things Every Photographer Should Know About HDR Photography, one of my books on Amazon and on PDF on my website, is that it does matter. If you select handheld for a photo that has been taken on a tripod, it will look different than if you selected taken on a tripod. You would think that they'd be the same, but you actually, in fine text, like in the example I use in the book, there's some words etched in stone, and those words etched in stone, it was taken on a tripod. So when I selected on a tripod, it looked great. When I selected handheld, it did not look so great. It was kind of fuzzy and blurry. So that is new here. This photograph was taken handheld. So I'm going to have handheld selected, and the maximum shift I go with is usually about 15%. I don't really go any higher than that. I like the default setting. Next, you're going to see show options to remove ghosts. It's not going to ask you how you want to remove those ghosts anymore. It used to say, do you want to do it automatically or do you want to do it yourself by selecting those deghosted areas. Now it just says show the options to remove ghosts. Or don't show the options to remove ghosts. If you know there's no ghosting in it, don't select that. But if you have a feeling that there could be some ghosting in your file, go ahead and select it. For this one, I don't believe there were any ghosts in the photograph because of the nature of the photograph, but I'm going to select it anyway to show you what's new here. So here is where it's going to be converting the file from the raw images to get it ready for processing in the tone mapping selection. Now it's going to be aligning all of those source images. It's telling you pretty much what it's doing here, just to make sure they all match up, and then it's going to bring you into the deghosting selection. So here I have the ability to select deghosting. If you do selective deghosting, this is something that you are familiar with in the past. If you selected an area that you thought might have some ghosting, you could just select that area and then right click and say, or actually go preview deghosting to see if it had any deghosting. And then you could also right click and remove that selection. Now I think there might be some ghosting actually right here with these little banners that we're waving, but we'll see. So if we preview that deghosting, sure enough, those waving banners have some ghosting there. So there was some ghosting in this image. That's one way you can select the ghosting. You can also go to automatic deghosting. Now with automatic deghosting, you get to select which photograph you want to be your base image. Now my suggestion for this for the ghosting would be one of either your 0, your -1, or your -2. And the reason why you wouldn't want to do your +1 or your +2 is that typically your exposures on the +1 and +2 side happen to be longer exposures so that it can take in more light to give you that amount of light. if it's doing that, it's going to be inviting a lot more room for noise. So if we selected something like the 0 exposure and then move that deghosting up, we can see that our deghosting right in this area is actually moving. I'll go ahead and zoom that, see if I can go ahead and do that, and then just bring this over to those little flags over there. So as I move this deghosting, you're going to see the effects that deghosting is having on those areas. It's pretty helpful. And now this isn't selective deghosting, this is automatic deghosting. If you see here, the time on the exposures, you can see it right here. So my F8 is 1/256 of a second, and then 1/128th for the -1, and then 1/64th for the 0, and then it goes into 1/32nd of a second and 1/16th. So for this, my focal length was about a 17mm because I was using a 17mm lens, so I could really get away with most of these. However, I'm seeing that there is some ghosting in those flags, so I can go ahead and bring that up, and I'll just leave it on that 0 exposure, and it looks like it's doing a pretty fine job. Or I can go back to the old school and just do the selective deghosting method. But let's go with the new one and see what happens. So we'll press OK, and now it's going to merge this file down. It knows what I want to be ghosted, the deghosted areas, and now it's going to merge it into an HDR file that I can go ahead and use to tone map. Now there is a new tone mapping method. Those of you who are familiar with Photomatix Pro 4.2.7 know that there was the tone compressor, and then there was the exposure fusion, which most people for HDR use the tone compressor. But there's a new one now, and this new one is located right up here called Contrast Optimizer. We'll go over that after we've used our details enhancer, which we're pretty familiar with. So this is from previous session, and I don't really like the preset that was there, so I'm going to go to method defaults and just default this back to 0 and give me a starting place for this photograph. Now there is another new feature here, and that is whether you want, if I go into preferences, you can make it so that when you make an adjustment, as you make the adjustment with the slider, it shows you what's happening, and that, I believe that is let's see, is it under performance? Pardon me. Okay, when adjusting preview refresh, when slider stops moving or continuously as slider moves. So for the sake of the tutorial, we'll just do it continuously as the slider moves, which what that means is, as I make an adjustment, it will automatically adjust the photograph as I move the slider. It used to be that you'd have to adjust it and then stop somewhere, and then it would allow you to go through, which at first I had a struggle with it, but I came to the point where I actually kind of liked it better that way. It moved a little bit faster. So if you're having, if you have a processor that's relatively slow, you might want to go with something like just refresh that after the slider moves. That way you're not putting too much pressure on your processor. Now I usually put the strength up to 100. Now up here during this whole phase that I'm going through, this tone mapping phase, you're going to see that there's some odd stuff happening in this window. I've looked at the source images, and that was something on the window itself. So I know that that's not a tone compression issue. I'm pretty sure that that has to do with maybe the tint that they put at the top of that bus window. This is actually a pretty cool place. I went to the City Museum with my family a couple weeks ago in St. Louis, and this is a bus that's overhanging the City Museum that you can walk into the back of the bus and you're on top of the building, but by the time you get to the driver's seat, you're hanging off the edge. It's pretty trippy. A lot of people were scared of it, but me and my 2.5-year-old, we just darted right up there and we had some fun. I took some pictures of him driving this bus. It was pretty cool. So strength, I always usually jack that up to 100% because if I'm doing tone mapping, I want that to be 100%. Now, I would say most case scenarios, my strength is at 100%. Color saturation, I usually don't like to go past 55 or 50 range. Anything higher than that, it's just too much saturation. I will handle that later in post-processing. So this is new here. This is tone compression. This used to be luminosity. They've changed the word luminosity to tone compression. What does that mean for your images? From what I can tell, nothing. They just changed the name to something more accurate because a lot of people didn't understand what tone compression was because it didn't really tell them right out what tone compression was. But tone compression is what happens to the tones, either lights and darks, as you manipulate them, and you can get some really nasty tone compression or you can get some pretty decent tone compression. It used to be called luminosity. Actually, as a matter of fact, any one of your previous presets, when you open it up, they will still default to this tone compression, and you won't have any problems. So if I selected one of my old presets, it's still going to be tone compression. It's not going to be listed under luminosity. So don't worry about that there. It's going to keep all that stuff the same. So for the most part, everything's pretty much the same when it comes to making a good tone mapped image. So tone compression, I'm going to go ahead and put that up. I usually start that up at the top and then work my way down. And then detail as contrast, I usually start that all the way up and then work my way down. I like to play with the lighting adjustments by moving it back and forth to see what I think works best. Now for most times, I like to make an HDR photograph that's not too dark, not too light, and not too stylized. I like to even try and get it as close to almost a 50% gray tone. So all I'm really doing is bringing out all of the detail within the photograph. I'm getting the best of both worlds here, because if you saw in the source images here, I'm not sure if you can see that in the source images. Let's see, let me scroll down to where those source images are. In the source images, in my 0 exposure, which would be right here, I've got a good looking sky. I don't have a very good foreground. And then as you get into the -1 and the -2, I've got a nice sky, or skyline I should say, and not a very good foreground. It's dark. But then as you get into the +1 and +2, you start to see that there's some more detail inside the actual bus. So that's where this HDR process really comes in and allows you to push and pull those tones to really bring out the image. So what I really like to do is just get a good baseline to work on that I can bring into Photoshop later and manipulate the tones myself. So I'm really trying to get just like a decent working detailed photograph that I can manipulate later in Photoshop a little bit further. Now you can do most of that stuff right here in Photomatix, but I think it's best to just wait and do a lot of that later. So if you go into the lighting adjustments, you're still going to see the same lighting adjustments that you saw in 4.2.7. But then if we go down to the more options, you've got smooth highlights, which I tend to bring that up a little bit because I like what it does in the photograph. And then you have your white point, which is going to adjust the white setting within the photograph. And then the black point, which is going to do the opposite. It's going to bring out more black or less black depending on where you put it. So I like to adjust these settings to a certain degree. I don't like them to be too high on one end or the other. On either the black or white, because I don't want something too dark, I don't want something too light, and I don't want something oversaturated. I like a nice baseline to start with. So I'm going to move the gamma up and see what happens when I move that up in comparison to what I moved up with the tone compression before. And I think the gamma is good at about 1.0. So the temperature, I'm going to move that into the warmer section. I tend to put most of my stuff on the warmer side. If you move to the right, it's warmer. If you move to the left, it gets a little cooler. So for this photograph, I can move just a little bit to the right, just to make it a little bit warmer. Now, micro smoothing, I tend to put that all the way down to get the most detail out of the photograph, but what you're going to notice is that it does bring about a lot of noise. So if you don't have a very good noise compression software, or you don't have a whole lot of noise control, either way, depending on how you do it, I don't suggest putting that micro smoothing all the way down. You can still get a very good HDR photograph without the micro smoothing. It just helps bring out some of that detail, and that's what I like. It's kind of that gritty HDR texture, and that's what I really go for with my HDR photograph. So we can see the preview, and we can see what happens after. Shadow smoothness and shadows clipping I don't even bother with. So now, moving forward, let's go and talk about Contrast Optimizer. And Contrast Optimizer is pretty cool because it gets some nice, realistic looking effects without that too grungy of an HDR look. So let's go back to defaults here. You're pretty limited with what you have. You have your strength, so let's move that all the way up and see what happens. You have your tone compression, let's move that all the way up and see what happens. And you have your lighting effects. And then if we go down here, we have our white clip and our black clip. That's where, if you could see our curve, if we go to the histogram, where you clip the whites, see how I'm pushing that curve all the way over to the whites, and it's now clipping my highlights. If I move the black all the way over, it's now clipping my shadows. And I don't really like to clip here in Photomatix because it's too restricted to just this program. If I'm going to do any clipping and any curve correction, I'm pretty much going to do that in Photoshop or something similar. Now, if you look at the midtones, we can push those midtones to the left or to the right. If we push those midtones all the way to the left, our midtones get on the darker scale. If we push all the way to the right, our midtones move to the left of the histogram. Now, this histogram does a good job of showing us what's happening to our photograph. It's pretty much showing us that we have no darks until we get to about here in our midtones, and we have barely any whites until we get to about the mid-white area. So we could maybe clip this a little bit on the black side, but we don't want it to go all the way over to this edge because then it starts to introduce some areas that can't be fixed very easily. Now the midtones, if we keep those back in the middle, or maybe even push those farther to the left, that's probably more like what we're going to be looking for. But you can continue to manipulate these however you see fit. Now, if I were to tell you that I, Blake Rudis, will put my clipping at this, and I will put my black clip at this, I would be lying to you because there is no tried and true method for every single HDR photograph. If you see here over on the right hand side of my Photomatix pane, I've got a lot of presets. I probably have about 100 here in Photomatix 5.0, and then on my other computer that crashed before, I had probably about 200. And if you can see Arizona Desert View, this was these aren't contrast optimizer enhancements, these are tone compressor presets, but I label my my presets by the lighting situation that I was in. So I know that for air show, that was taken for the air show pictures. So any pictures I process for the air show of 2 years ago that I went to, I know that I can use that setting, and it'll pretty much be good for those photographs. So, and I do that because I do a lot of batch processing. It's a good thing to make a preset if you're going to do a batch process. And they did add some stuff to batch processing here. You can use multiple presets for batch processing, but it really does help. So I know that, hey, at the Atkins Museum, I used this preset. So we can go back to our the one that we had created before we went into Contrast Optimizer, and we were in our Details Enhancer. Let me see here. Where were we? We were about right here. The tone compression up. We had our lighting adjustments going. So this is about where we were before I started messing around with things. So if you press apply and you're good to go, you'll be given some options that you weren't necessarily given before. So what I suggest, if anybody post-processes a photograph further beyond Photomatix, which I highly suggest you go beyond Photomatix. You don't just go with the HDR image that you get in Photomatix because it does need a lot of work. It's still at this point a negative that needs to go into Photoshop for some more detail work, or if it's Lightroom you use, go ahead and use Lightroom, or Paint Pro, whatever it is that you use, go right ahead and do that. There are a couple of selections over here now that are different. You can it gives you buttons right here that says double tone map. Do you want to tone map this again? So you can tone map on top of a tone mapped image. And I'm going to tell you that's not always the best idea. It can get really grungy and really nasty really quick. I don't suggest doing it unless you know what you're going to do with that. If I double tone map something, I'm usually double tone mapping it for a specific area, and I save the file 2 different ways. I would save this when I go to File, Save As, and save it as a 16-bit TIFF for maybe the sky, and then double tone map it for the foreground and save it as for the foreground, and then mask it later and put the foreground on top of the background so the whole image doesn't look double tone mapped, just the area that I want to be double tone mapped. And then you can also redo with other settings. So if you didn't like this after it was all said and done, you can go back and say redo with other settings and you're good to go. Or you can save the image. Right here you can go to save final image. So there's some new things here that are right here within Photomatix Pro. You can view the settings, which is pretty cool, especially if you're a tutorial based person like I am. I always do these multiple times. I process the same photograph before I do tutorial. So what I could do is probably take a screenshot of this and put it on my other monitor so that, you know, I know what I'm doing as I'm going through the tutorial. Or if you want to keep maybe a card catalog of your methods, that's fine. or if you own a website and you want to maybe copy this and put it on your website so that people know exactly what your settings were, that's a cool idea too. I do like this settings thing. Now, in order to get that, you might need to do a screenshot and go ahead and cut it out so you can put that on your website. That way, instead of giving them the exact tone map preset, you can just give them the method that you used. So that's pretty cool. You can also save those settings, which is very cool, as an XMP file so that you can go back to it for later use. And then at this point, I would go File, I'd go Save As, and I always save it as a 16-bit TIFF to wherever I am going to be doing my work in the future. So again, I'm Blake Rudis with EverydayHDR.com and HDRinsider.com. If you like these tutorials, I do these quick snippet tutorials on EverydayHDR.com, but on HDR Insider, I do full-length workflow tutorials where I go from the very beginning of what I did with that photograph all the way to the very end of how I post-processed it all the way through Photoshop. It is a subscription-based website, $1.99 a month or $20 for a year. But what you get out of that is more than what you pay for. I promise it's more than what you pay for. So again, Blake Rudis, EverydayHDR.com, HDR Insider, and this is what is new with Photomatix Pro 5.0. Have a great weekend.